I came to the United States in 1977, and I came here just to spend a weekend, actually. I was a filmmaker at the time, and Blanka was living with our son in Germany, so she came 6 months after me. And so I ended up in Philadelphia just by coincidence, pretty much.
Tell us what you found in Philadelphia.
Well, the first play that I saw was Let My People Come. If you can imagine. And I was like, this is avant-garde because people take their clothes off, but of course it wasn't. It was a little musical, very successful. It was running in a small black box theater, cabaret really, but it was really, that was frivolous.
And I was making TV spots and very short films, and then I got sort of tired of it. And both Blanka and I decided to join the Wilma project. At the time, it was the name of the company. But the company was really just a non-profit status and a phone.
Also, I was surprised that people wanted to be paid for doing theater. I was like, come on, it's a privilege to do theater. You shouldn't want to make money on that.
Don't tell anybody that here.
I know.
No,
I was very young.
Talk about subversive. No.
Welcome to Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz, and the podcast theme music is composed by Christopher Mark Colucci. The voices you just heard were Jiri Zizka and Blanka Zizka, the two people who changed the Wilma project into the Wilma Theater, which eventually became what it is today, one of Philadelphia's leading theatrical institutions. Now, let me say right from the start, these recordings were not made at the same time or at the same place, and they were not my interviews. I did not even make these recordings. These are some of the archival recordings that I've been hoping to use during this season of the podcast about modern Philadelphia theater history and bring you the voices of significant people in Philadelphia's theater history. I must thank right at the start Linda Weiner, the former theater critic for Newsday, for giving me permission to use excerpts from her 2006 interview with Blanka Zizka, which was created as one of a public television series made by the League of Professional Theater Women. And I must also thank Professor Paula Marantz-Cohen from Drexel University in Philadelphia for allowing me to use portions of her 2011 interview with Jiri Zizka, created as part of her YouTube series, The Drexel Interview. As this episode goes along, I will also be using some interview clips with Blanka from a 2020 recording by Professor Marcia Ferguson of the University of Pennsylvania. We heard from Marcia speaking about the Wilma, of course, in our last podcast episode. And I'm also going to share her voice again with some excerpts of another recorded conversation that she and I had over Zoom in April of this year. And in previous episodes, I've been privileged to talk directly with quite a few one-time leaders of Philadelphia nonprofit theater companies, and I'm planning to speak with Blanka Zizka myself in the near future. But because Jiri Zizka is no longer with us, he passed away in January of 2012, I wanted to try this method of having both Blanka's and Jiri's voices in this episode at the same time. So, as you can imagine, I spent a lot of time recently with sound editing software, sorting and crafting all these separate audio files into one overall narrative. And to that end, I'm going to add quite a bit of my own text, stories about the Wilma Theater during the 1980s and 90s that I've compiled over the years. First, let's let Jiri and Blanka tell us a bit about their life and theater work before they came to America as young people growing up in communist-controlled Czechoslovakia. That's not technically part of Philadelphia theater history, of course, but it had a big impact on the sort of work they would eventually do in Philadelphia, as well as the sort of plays and playwrights that they would be attracted to.
Czechoslovakia at the time, and I sometimes think that it's kind of interesting thing that happened during the communism. You know, we didn't have bad or good neighborhoods. We didn't have neighborhoods where rich people would be living and poor people would be living, because the communism changed that, mixed everybody up. So I was living in a house where my parents were living in one room, my grandparents were living in another room. The next room, there was some senior citizens, the husband and wife, where she was a cleaning woman, he was a garbage collector, and they end up also being kind of my babysitters in a way, and they were also informing on my parents, we found out later.
Right.
I could not, I always, theater artist. Well,
okay.
If you say like at the age of 10 that that I, on my own impulse made my own little puppet theater and was knocking on the doors of kindergartens like a volunteer. I wanted to play theater, perform theater for the little kids there. Yes, then I would be a theater artist. And then I got involved with an underground kind of movement theater that was very much influenced by Jerry Grotowski's work. By the time I was growing up in 1970s, when I became a teenager and got into my early 20s, I actually went to Poland to see theater because it was close by and it was a different world.
Both Blanka and I were part of several theater companies. One was called KQN, which roughly translated means he who quacks does not bite. The other was called Flintstone. I'm not kidding about that.
Were these underground sort of theater groups?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It was difficult to be underground because the society was very tightly controlled. So you had to go around these procedures. For example, we would rehearse a play for 6 months and never open, so we wouldn't have to have someone approve the script.
Okay, so your rehearsals became the productions.
Open performances.
Oh, how interesting.
Right. And at this time I was also involved in filmmaking, and that was also state-controlled. So it was a very difficult period. We just couldn't do what we wanted to do, and also we needed more education. We couldn't travel abroad, so both of us independently decided that we would like to leave, and we did.
So how old were you when you left Czechoslovakia?
24, I believe, 76. 24.
You left, you spent a year in a refugee camp in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And then
camps, yeah.
In camps,
yeah.
Various camps. And at that point you were pregnant?
Yeah.
And you had left with your companion.
Well, he went through the camps too.
Okay.
Except we were not married,
yes.
and so he went to a different camp than I did. So I was alone in that camp, and but theater goddess stood by me because somehow I ended up in a room with a Romanian circus acrobat and Hungarian lion tamer. You will think that I'll make it up because it sounds like Fellini, but maybe there was an idea of some kind of a bureaucrat or all these people from performing arts, let's put them together into one room. So it was quite an experience because by then I was probably about in the fifth month, and I would wake up in the morning and then the acrobat would be standing upside down on a chair, twirling like these little rings around at her feet, and the lion tamer would be snoring like a lion. She had a little whiskers, and I would be writing this very, very unhappy letters to Jiri, to the other camp. So he didn't know what to do. He was very desperate about my situation there, so he went to this little pub and played a slot machine and won 60 marks, and he bought me a flute and sent me a flute. So I was there, added to the chorus.
So romantic.
He, over the phone, met a person from Czechoslovakia, Paul Fielinger, who was an animator, and he invited Jiri for a weekend, and Jiri ended up working for him for 4 years.
Uh-huh.
And so then I came with Christoph already. Christoph was 9 months by then, and had moved to Philadelphia directly.
As we've detailed previously, this was when the Zizkas first became involved with the Wilma project. But again, we'll let them tell the story.
It was a very small company. I think they existed on about something like $19,000 budget a year. One of those companies that existed in the 1970s, tried to do experimental work. It was a really collaboration of artists. And none of them really had theater training. So when I went to visit them for the first time, and I could not really speak any English, so I spoke to them in German. There was the director had a German girlfriend, and he spoke German. So we talked in German, and I offered them to teach warm-ups, just vocal and physical warm-ups, and using the Grotowski method. And that's how it started.
And Blanka started a very interesting workshop. It was based on a very physical way of acting, sort of invented by Grotowski. And our first project was an adaptation of Animal Farm. Mm-hmm. So through improvisation and then adaptation, we put this show on. It was the only show we really co-directed.
You did it together.
We both did together adaptation of Animal Farm, and then I started to work on that with the students from my class, and Jiri did lights and kind of came to oversee it.
It also took us about 6 months to put that first show on, and it was all done on I think the budget was like $500. It's an incredible effort.
Animal Farm was finally presented by the Wilma Project in a loft space in Old City in May and June of 1979, and then again in October and November because it was such a success. The script for this production, unfortunately, is lost, so I can't look at it for you, but several photographs survive, including one of Blanka herself leading the cast on an outdoor promotional ramble during a Philadelphia street festival. All the actors are dressed in dark coats, trousers, and broad-brimmed hats, and they're all wearing white clown makeup and small mustaches. The Inquirer critic Douglas Keating came to see the show, and immediately, he wrote, he knew he was in for a treat. Quote, "The elaborate set is a striking, cleverly designed jumble of rough wood, straw, iron wheels, harnesses, and other assorted equipment. It takes up a lot of space, more floor area, in fact, than has been allotted for the folding chairs and cushions on which the audience sits. The second scene opens with two characters walking through the audience on yard-high stilts. Right then, the audience gets the idea that this is not going to be a usual production. Drums are banged, chains are rattled, ropes are swung, actors speak in sing-song, they dance around, they climb all over the set, and of course, some of them walk on stilts. There is always something to listen to and something to look at." Clearly, the Wilma Project was on its way. In fact, this meant that institutional funders, who, as we know, were desperate for the next big thing in Philadelphia theater, were beginning to take interest.
And because the Wilma Project was already incorporated, it was an already non-profit. We had people come in to see it from NEA and Pensacola Council on the Arts, and they gave us a first grant, which was $3,000.
So using this new funding, by June 1980, the Zizkas had put together another project, Garden of Delights, a surrealist play by the Spanish writer Fernando Arrabal. This one was directed by Jiri and featured Blanka in the role of Lais. The cast also included Barbara McKeely, Tony Glazer, and John Lawrence. Now, if you wanted to catch the whole run of this show back in 1980, you had to move around town a bit. Initially, the Wilma had shared an early version of it at the Bread Street studio in Old City, and in October, it had staged it again at the Christian Association at 3601 Locust Street on the Penn campus in West Philadelphia. But by early November, the Wilma Project moved the show to the Philadelphia Company's space at 312 South Broad Street. The Inquirer's Douglas J. Keating, who had caught this final version of the Garden of Delights, was once again wowed, writing that the piece was a theatrical kaleidoscope that entrances with its sensory impact. Garden of Delights takes the theatergoer into the mind of a mad woman, and a crazy, fascinating place it is. The principal character is Lais, a famous actress who lives in seclusion in a mansion along with her servants, her beloved birds, and an escapee from a mental institution who is in love with her and whom she treats like a pet dog. Lais views her past through the prism of her madness, and the play is the refracted image. The important people in her life, her childhood girlfriend and her first lover, are inhuman exaggerations. The friend is not a very friendly, sadistic lesbian, and her first love is kind of a magician, and also a bit of a sadist who possesses a time machine disguised as a football helmet. Jiri Zizka has the performers walk and talk in some scenes like mechanical dolls, moving their arms and legs to the clanging beat of an iron bar. Laisa's childhood maunderings about her imagined ugliness culminate in her eagerly grabbing a hooded character to kiss, only to find Frankenstein's monster beneath the cloak. Like characters in a dream, the cast overacts with enthusiasm, a pose that matches the insane, absurdist nature of the play. Well, interestingly, by that point, the Wilma Project was still touring its first show, Animal Farm, around to local area schools. And they even planned to do it again in the summer of 1981 out in Malvern, Pennsylvania, where the People's Light and Theater Company wanted to do as part of its New Plays Festival. Unfortunately, at that point, the George Orwell estate over in England had finally gotten wind of this adaptation and had refused the Wilma permission to use it. Nothing ironic about that at all. But it didn't really matter, because by that point, the Zizkas had more funding, and the board of the Wilma Project had decided on a new plan. They would change the name of the group to the Wilma Theater under the couple's joint leadership, and they would get their own space.
And I think it was in 1980 when we found this abandoned little warehouse on Sansom Street that back in 1915 was a car factory. Mm-hmm. They produced, in the basement, they produced like 2 cars a year. That's what I was told. First year we had about 89, and then we started to sell out, so we decided to extend the seating space by 1 row, which sort of doubled our budget at the time. So eventually 99 seats. It was a very small space. It was lower than this room here. It was only 12 feet high, very small.
Now, when Jiri said we added the seats, he really meant we. He and Blanka, with some help, of course, were doing a lot of the demolition and construction work themselves on this odd building that they had gotten control of. In the front, along Sansom Street, there were 3 former 3-storied 19th century row houses. Well, they were houses back in the day. In the early 20th century, the central one's ground level had been blasted open to make the entranceway for an auto repair business. So that opening was filled with glass doors, and above that they put the theater marquee. Now, behind it on the first floor, they laid out a lobby, and they put offices upstairs and the old bedrooms. Out to the rear, along one of those narrow Philly alleyways, which has a name, in this case it's Moravian Street, the property opened up wider into a 3-lot wide auto garage. In fact, in all the cases that we've come across here on the podcast of the history of Philadelphia theaters being made into parking lots or garages, this is the first and only time I know of where the process was going the other way. So finally, the urban fabric was healing itself, at least in this one case. And in this rear section of the building, the Zizkas literally sandblasted the oil stains off the old bricks, threw on a lot of black paint, installed electrics and a light grid. They put a platform on one side and rows of chairs on the other. Downstairs in the basement were the dressing rooms. Upstairs was rehearsal space. And by October of 1981, this theater was open for audiences. Interestingly, the very first Wilma Theater production under its new name, in their new theater space, was not another avant-garde exploration of a European text. It was The Wool Gatherer, a gritty 2-character realistic drama by the Trenton playwright William Mastro Simone. It was even set in South Philadelphia. Jiri Zizka directed, Michael Toner played Cliff, the hard-bitten truck driver, and Terry Fimiano Guerin, a young actress just out of Bob Headley's Villanova program, played Rose, the somewhat unbalanced dime store candy clerk who brings Cliff back to her apartment. It just goes to demonstrate that right from the start, although it certainly had an approach to making theater, you can't really pigeonhole the Wilma into a theater that always just did one sort of play. The Zizkas, as they used to say, like to surprise themselves. That's how they like to work. The other thing that strikes me now, looking back on it, is that the Wilma started using local professional actors right away. In fact, Michael Toner and Terry Guerin, who I just mentioned, are still part of the Philly theater community. They're still working. I know Michael. I performed with him, a lovely man. And Terry, of course, is my neighbor. And she's even been on the podcast. You may remember. She was the guide who walked us through the Paul Robeson house back in episode 35. So anyway, back to our story. The Wilma began hiring a small staff, and it started staging about 4 plays a year. Now, some of them were the sort of Eastern European plays you might expect them to take on. My friend Michael Whistler, who was an undergraduate at Penn back in the early 80s, remembers a production of Carol Capek's The Insect Play, in which one actress spent the whole first act in a cocoon. Blanka, for her part, played the butterfly. But after that point, Blanka mostly stopped performing and turned to directing. The Zizkas, both of them, usually worked with local lighting, costume, and set designers, although not always. They would also bring in people from New York. Sometimes people would come in from Europe. Now, typically, Jiri and Blanka worked separately, each of them directing their own plays, in tandem. After all, they both had a son to raise and also a small business to run. And they were not there to explore working in the theater for a few years and see how this took them. This was their life.
And again, I was more outside. I didn't go to see too much of the traditional theater, but I felt there was a lot of theater artists doing theater, and somehow, it was like doing theater without seeing it as you have to do it, that it's a necessity, that you cannot do anything else. And I think that's why the Wilma in a way succeeded, because both Jiri and I felt this is the only thing that we could do, as opposed to some other young people who are trying to do theater, and if it's not going to work, they will do something else. They will move on to something else, become doctors.
Unfortunately, I can't talk about every single play that Jiri and Blanka Zizka staged over the next 20 years. But let me walk you through some highlights. We'll go all the way to 2000, and I'll bring in more sound clips from the archival interviews with them as we go along. August 15th, 1983. The Wilma announced that it had reached an agreement with Actors Equity Association that allowed it to employ union actors for its 1983-1984 season. For the present season, they would commit to hiring at least 2 union actors, and the number would slowly be increased over the next 5 seasons. By the end of that period, the Wilma would become a full equity house. Typically, the Wilma wasn't easing into its new status, but was plunging right into a sort of ambitious material that had already become its brand. The season would open in October with a production of the notoriously challenging play Marat Sade. And its first 2 equity actors hired were Kenneth Talberth and James McConnell, who played the Herald and Mad Animal, respectively. March 1984. Michael Cerveris was Dorian in The Picture of Dorian Gray. The actor's excellent work as the dissolute Englishman was all the more impressive because he was then fresh out of Yale College. In fact, the eventual Broadway star earned his equity card, appearing at the Wilma. Cerveris played not only the eternally young Dorian on the stage, but also the old, decrepit man in the portrait. Here, Jiri Zizka employed his movie-making skills. They filmed Michael's gradual aging throughout one night, slowly applying layers of makeup for each shot. At one point, he was startled to see he looked just like his father, and then several stages later, he became his grandfather. And then, as Blanka herself later recalled, by 4 a.m., Michael looked 100 years old, and we all felt like we stared at death. March 12, 1985, Eugene O'Neill's 1922 expressionist drama The Hairy Ape opened at the Wilma. Harry Bennett starred as the physically powerful working man Yank, whose mental state deteriorates over the course of the drama as he's buffeted by the indignities of society and capitalism. It was the first American play that the 30-year-old Blanka Zizka had ever directed. May 1st, 1986, the Wilma Theater's production of 1984, a Pavel Kohout adaptation of George Orwell's famous novel, directed by Jiri Zizka, opened at the theater space on Sansom Street. The multimedia presentation, under Zizka's orchestration, had been in rehearsal for 9 weeks, thanks to a special grant. The settings were by Philip Granetto, costumes were by Pamela Keach, lighting was John Musel, and sound by Charles Cohen and Adam Wernick. Makeup design was by Abelinda Hyde, and cinematography by Michael Bailey. It was, overall, An unprecedented undertaking in the history of our theater, said Jiri Zizka in a newspaper interview. Thanks to a special grant from the Mabel Pugh Myron Trust and the Pennsylvania Council of the Arts, the director had been allowed an extended period of work with his creative team, as well as an extended audition process and almost 10 weeks of rehearsal with the 14-member cast. Reportedly, Zizka used every minute of it, working from 10 a.m. to midnight the whole time, coordinating the technical details and working with the cast, some of them brought down from New York for the duration of the show. Production costs ran up to $40,000, about twice the budget for any other Wilma show up to that point. In The Inquirer, reviewer William Collins praised the production highly. This is the kind of disciplined director's theater that we've learned to expect from Zizka, and it has rarely been so complex, so developed, and so thought out, he wrote. Sound and picture define the element in which people live. In separating out the rebellious hero, Winston Smith, from his regimented peers, everyone else goes into slow-motion mime while he speaks his thoughts. His memories appear to us on a screen behind him. Impressed by this write-up, the New York Times critic Mel Gussow came down to see the show himself, and his laudatory review, entitled Orwell's 1984 Rises from Page to Stage, would end up cementing the Wilma's growing reputation and stature in American theater. Wrote Gussow, "It is evident from Mr. Zizka's production of 1984 that the Wilma is energizing Philadelphia theater." By this point in time, company members who worked with them regularly noticed that each of the two directors had their own style of approaching a play. Here's Marcia Ferguson, who worked with both of the Zizkas during the 1980s.
Jiri was soft-spoken, and he would say, "See what you can do with this," or "What if you played with? What if she was always carrying that?" As an actor, I would be handed a prop by Jiri, for example. Mm-hmm. When I played Major Stone in Happy End, I was given at different times like a riding whip and like these different crazy things. And the visual elements were those were sort of the points of attention in the room. Things like props, things like lights. And as a company, we were directed to respond to those things. With Blanka, it was much more visceral. She had an amazing way of pulling out vocal and emotional. I remember her working with me on Mildred's scream, for example, when Mildred first sees Yank in the boiler room and he's covered with, black stuff. But this scream had to be a very particular scream. And I was struggling with it because it was vocally hard and it was just emotionally, just to jump into. It happened very early in the play. It was very important to Blanka that the scream be right. And somehow she sort of magically drew it out of me. And it was about visualization, and it was about trying different emotional states to kind of draw forth this very specific kind of scream that would, really that scream in some ways you could think of it as the precipitating incident and makes everything fall into place after that. So I understand why it was so important and why we spent so much time. But I think Jiri might have gotten to it had he been directing that production through a prop or through handing Mildred something or like some color or something on her dress or soot in her eye or something different. So that's the best way I can think of to differentiate.
September 28th, 1987. The Wilma staged Macbeth by Eugene Ionesco, using Charles Marowitz's translation. Blanka Zizka directed, with settings and costume designed by Hiroshi Iwasaki. Macbeth was an absurdist version of the Shakespeare play of a similar name. The plot followed both Macbeth, played by Stephen Temperley, and Banquo, played by James Maxwell, as they tried to grab the throne of Duncan, done by Robert McCallum. Meanwhile, the actress Leslie Vogel played multiple roles: Lady Duncan, Lady Macbeth, and also a witch, who at one point made an exit right out the back of the theater into the alley behind, riding a motorcycle. April 1988. The run of statements after an arrest under the Immorality Act by the South African playwright Athol Fugard was so successful that an additional 2 months in the late summer had been added by the Wilma, and then it ran again from July into early September. Blanka Zizka had directed. The show had a cast of 5, but principally featured 2 actors, Michael Rogers and Kate Skinner, in the roles of Errol and Frida, an interracial couple whose love life is brutally exposed by a sudden South African police raid. The costumes were by Donna Lee Sippel, although, admittedly, she only had to provide clothes for the actor Peter Delorier, who was the policeman. The 2 main characters, as scripted, spent the entire 70-minute play entirely in the nude, the violation of their private lives and souls made evident to all. Gerald Forsyth's shadowy lighting did much to shield the 2 actors from constant exposure during the presentation, and the director, Zizka, employed 2 additional actors with flashlights to follow the surprised lovers around the stage. Such was the artful direction of their movements that many in the audience were surprised when they came out at the end for a curtain call. In fact, more and more, the Zizkas were gaining status among leading world playwrights, not only Fugard and Ionesco, but also 2 writers who had particular ties to Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel and Tom Stoppard. In his 2011 interview, Jiri talked about these 2 in particular with Paula Morantz-Cohen.
I go from Martin McDonagh, an Irish playwright, to Stephen Sondheim, to Tom Stoppard. He's very close to our way of thinking. If you notice, if you look at his canon of work, he doesn't write plays twice.
Yes.
Like he wouldn't write another Arcadia.
Right.
And Night and Day is really like a night and day to any other play he's ever written.
Yeah.
It's fairly naturalistic. It still has those kind of devices that he likes, so it's surprising.
Do you find, having met him and knowing him, I guess, fairly well, that you have this similar sensibility in general?
Yeah. I was just wondering, once I also directed a feature film based on a Václav Havel play. He's the Czech president who was a playwright and later became president. He wrote a play, Largo de Zlato, and Tom adapted it. And I directed a film of that for WNET Great Performances with F. Murray Abraham. And so when he came to see Night and Day, and when Tom came, we talked about, like, what would it be like if Václav Havel would suddenly sit down and write a play now that he's been a president for, I don't know, X many years. And we sort of agreed that it probably would be a terrible play.
He's been spoiled as a playwright, no doubt.
Because he would repeat himself.
Yeah, and you don't like repetition.
Exactly, yeah.
The spring of 1989 was a heady time for the Wilma Company. It had recently been announced that it would begin plans for an entirely new theater building to be constructed on South Broad Street. Meanwhile, back in the Little Theater on Sansom Street, Blanka Zizka's production of Tom Dulack's Incommunicado was receiving rave reviews and, again, an extended run. The theater's previous productions of Charles Ludlam's The Mystery of Irma Vep had just successfully transferred out to People's Light and Theater in Malvern. And the Wilma was receiving national attention for its collaboration with Joe Papp's New York Shakespeare Festival on Václav Havel's Temptation. Both the Zizkas and Papp had long-standing professional relationships with the dissident Czech playwright who had recently been jailed again by the communist regime in his country. Temptation was an adaptation of the Dr. Faustus myth for modern Czechoslovakian reality. In it, Dr. Faustka battles against a totalitarian regime for independence of thought, and he makes a deal with a devil named Fistula. At the end of the play, there was a grand scene derived from the Goethe version of the Faust story, an elaborate witches' Sabbath party. When Jiri Zizka had first sought rights to stage the play, however, he had discovered that Joseph Papp already had those rights. A joint production was proposed, and in March 1989, it opened at the Public Theater in Manhattan, starring David Strathairn in the main role. This New York production had been largely panned by Manhattan critics. Fatally, the powerful Frank Rich in the New York Times had been especially dismissive.
As was demonstrated by his grotesque production of 1984, 2 seasons ago,
Zizka loves theatrical toys, slideshows, electronic music, fluorescent lighting, high-tech scenery, and scantily clad female bodies. Words, ideas, and actors don't concern him too much. It's hard to know whether to blame the director or the cast for the poor quality of the performance. So, ouch. After this critical drubbing, the entire production was supposed to then travel down to Philadelphia to do it again. However, most of its cast, including David Strathairn, decided to withdraw from the show at that point rather than spend the next few weeks in the Quaker City. But the Zizkas and Pap persisted, and after some delays and much recasting, the show was remounted for a 4-day run in Philadelphia. Michael Butler and Priscilla Shanks were now the leading roles, and Ian Trigger became Fistula. The Zellerbach Theater on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania was booked for the weekend. But something about this new cast seemed to breathe new life into the show. According to many who saw both productions, in Philadelphia, the show was vastly improved. Wrote Philadelphia Daily News critic Nels Nelson, "The chief redeeming features of the production, over and beyond Jerry Rojo's stunning and versatile high-tech set, are two virtuoso actors, both newcomers to the Philadelphia stage, who give it a very special joy. Ian Trigger is worth alone the price of admission as the eccentric Fistula, and Neil Vipond injects a pyrotechnic sparkle into the role of the Institute director that Havel couldn't have dreamed it had." The Camden Courier-Press declared, "It ranks as one of the Wilma's most memorable productions, sharply staged and brilliantly cast. It deserves a run of 40 days, not 4. All right, folks, with that dramatic high note, I think we've come to a good place to pause in what is turning out to be a truly epic story. Even though we're not yet at the year 2000 in our narrative about the early years of the Wilma, our ultimate goal, I'm going to declare this to be part 1 of the Wilma story. So, just like this is a play that we're all watching together, let's get out of our seats, stretch our legs, get something to drink, talk amongst ourselves. You can even turn your phones back on if you want, and text your friends about what a great time you're having. Tell them to hustle on over to the podcast and listen in too, because you really want to talk to them about it. And meanwhile, while you got your phone out, check out the accompanying blog post about the Wilma on our website, www.aithpodcast.com. There's a handy link in the episode notes on whatever podcasting app you're using. And then get yourself ready for part 2 of the Wilma story. I'll get it out on the podcast feed just as soon as I can, I promise. I'm Peter Schmitz, and our podcast theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. Additional background music is from the good folks at Epidemic Sound. Stay tuned for even more Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia.